allowing me to join you even virtually. I'm sorry to have created all these hiccups with the sound and everything else, but I'm looking forward to being able to hear the rest of the discussion as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of a feminist perspective in a left movement. And I think this is important, and because of the audience, right? I mean, I think I'm speaking to like-minded people out here. I think I'm speaking to people who understand what it means to be in the left movement and an anti-colonial movement. And I want to talk about why a feminist perspective is so important in this. I believe Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and pretty much all of you, I'm sure, are broadly in line with an internationalist view of the world, which recognizes the importance of imperialism. Yeah? And for me, imperialism is the struggle of large capital to control economic territory when it is assisted by states. So we know that imperialism is not dead. It certainly didn't die with the end of political colonization or the phase of decolonization. And it hasn't died today in very, very explicit and overt ways. So the territory that is sought to be controlled is very complex and wide, and its scope is constantly expanding. The territory obviously includes things like land and nature, and we know that. And that was what traditionally imperialism was all about, controlling land, especially the parts of land that are very rich with natural resources and oil and minerals and so on. But it also includes controlling markets of different kinds. It includes controlling labor in different kinds and in different places. But it also includes all kinds of new economic territory. So, for example, a whole range of property that had just very recently been created, like intellectual property, which really, for the first half of my life, was really not seen as that knowledge is something that you can split up into units and commercialize, privatize, and monopolize. Yet we now know that that is a very major part of the control of economic territory. A whole range of essential utilities and amenities that were earlier seen as part of public provision and automatic and a right of every citizen, like water or basic needs of that kind, electricity and so on, are now also privatized. And there is also increasingly seen as new economic territory. I don't know whether here in your room you have bottled water, but in every conference or seminar I attend in the US, there is bottled water in those little plastic bottles. It's a form of privatization which is creating economic territory that didn't exist earlier. And we now have also control over cyberspace. In other words, the kinds of economic territory that are now recognized and are fought over by large capital with the assistance of states are continuously expanding. And that expansion means it reflects two things. One is, of course, the constant ability of capital to reinvent itself. But the other is the fact that it needs to do that because the traditional markets are all either saturated or dying, that the growing inequality has meant massive underconsumption and an inability to generate expansion simply because of the major inequalities that have grown as a result. Now, all of this I think you probably all know, and this is probably the frame in which you're looking at a lot of international relations today. To me, one of the major things that has been missing in this perspective is the critical insight provided by feminist economics, particularly the issue of unpaid labor. And it is something that only recently got to be recognized, let's admit it, even by radical scholars, by thinkers from the left. It is essentially a recognition of the fact that the economy rests on a combination of different kinds of labor, which extend from extremely well paid and highly professional, and which are really close to capital in the sense that the highest paid workers on earth are probably the bankers of New York City, who get not just salaries but also shares in the firms that they are participating in and so on, down the entire range of lower and lower and lower paid labor to the unpaid labor. And that spectrum, the significance of unpaid labor, is something that has been typically left out. So radical economists have tended to focus on all the different types of paid labor. But we have not given, at least in the past, we did not give sufficient attention to the issue of unpaid labor. And that's absolutely critical because it affects all other parts of the ways in which markets are generated and commercial activity is created. So, one thing we know is that there's a very strong gender division of labor and unpaid labor. So, this is why perhaps it's really, as I said, feminist economists who focused on it, but I do believe it's the major contribution. And that gender dimension stems from an essential biological fact, which is that women have been the ones giving birth to children. But it extends way beyond that. In other words, the biological activity of giving birth requires 9 months of pregnancy and maybe at most another year of continuous involvement with the child. But it does not involve the entire range of activities that are then seen as part of women's work, which is the care of others in the household, the direct and indirect care. So not only are you looking after the young, the old, the less physically able, and so on and so forth, but you're also doing the cooking, cleaning, fetching, carrying, provisioning for the household, none of which requires biology. But it has been made in pretty much all societies into this gendered division of labor. Now, the critical thing about this, of course, is that within families and it also often within communities, it is unpaid work. And it is often not even recognized as such. It is not really seen, at least in capitalist market framework, as productive activity. And many of the women who do this are not even classified as being in the labor force. In India, for example, the statistics identifies them as being engaged in household duties, which are not seen as part of the productive economy. But in fact, this unpaid workforce is the critical substratum on which the entire economy depends, and it actually subsidizes the rest of the recognized or formal market economy. And because of this existence of unpaid labor, a number of other issues arise with respect to the segmentation of the labor market and occupational segregation, which is that first of all, when women do enter paid workforce, they're typically entering first or most into those activities that are associated with the unpaid work that they do at home, in care activities of different kinds, at different levels of pay and so on, or in very low paid activities. So it already assumes that you're going to, if you can work for free, then your reservation wage is obviously very low. And so typically the more unpaid work is performed by women in any society, the larger the gender wage gaps. And of course, once you get the occupational segregation, then anyone who does that kind of work faces the same wage penalty. So men who do, let's say, looking after children in nurseries or preschool child teaching and pedagogy and so on, are also facing the wage penalty. That's in terms of the labor process. The labor market segmentation extends into other things as well. It extends into race, caste in India, ethnic origin, linguistic migration status, etc., a lot of other things. The other aspect of this is that it then influences the control over assets. So assets are hugely divided not only, of course, by class, which we know, which is really the definitional sort of part of what makes a class, but also within classes by gender. And part of this is related to the need to ensure that all this unpaid work continues. In other words, you see, it's not just that it so happens that it's being done. It's the societies need this work to be done on a regular basis without any problem. And you need a sort of enforcing mechanism to make sure it's done all the time. And therefore, you have to deprive those who are, in a sense, being forced to do it, of other possibilities of not having to do it, to deprive them of potential earning activities or access to assets that would deny them. It also affects the nature of social policies. States and private employers rely on this unpaid work and on the division of labor that is associated with it, which is very culturally defined. they rely on this in terms of being able to cut back on a whole range of social provision, on using business cycles in periods of austerity. Austerity is really another way of forcing more unpaid labor onto households, which really means onto women. And a whole range of other activities. So it is not that public policies are gender blind. Rather, public policies are gender exploitative. They exploit the fact of these gender differences, whether they say so or not. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because these are typically missing from most of our movements for economic sovereignty or for basic, for working class control or anything. We tend to put this as subordinate to the broader and larger requirements that we have of an economic system. So we don't see these as an integral part of the economic transformation that we want. We see them as coming later, maybe. I mean, this has been true for more than a century, right? Women in the left movement have always been told, wait till the class struggle wins, wait till the proletarian revolution, and then we'll sort out your problems, and so on. But it's something that is still missing, and I want to emphasize this. And it is still missing across the world in many, many progressive movements that I can think of. Now, all of this obviously, as I said, affects the left movements, but I want to emphasize that once you have a gender perspective, you realize how both economic processes and economic policies cannot be understood, really, without looking at that particular important difference. And it clearly is fiscal policies, for example, directly impact men and women differently, tax policies for sure, but they also have implications in that how you raise the resources and how much you raise impacts your ability to provide public services. And I've already pointed out the gender implications of providing or not providing essential public services and the quality of those services and the ways in which they are provided and all of that. They affect monetary and financial policies. And we already know that the financial world is even more unequally divided. Wealth is even more unequally distributed than income, both across classes and by gender. And that policies that disproportionately favor the wealthy or that disproportionately benefit large capital also therefore have a strong gender dimension. They affect industrial policies, and I want to emphasize this because this is the current fashion again, right? Everybody is now buzzing about industrial policy. It's suddenly come back. The thing that could not be named is now on everybody's lips, and everyone's talking about industrial policy. There are many aspects of industrial policy, some of which reflect on what I was talking about earlier, about imperialism and neocolonialism and all that. But there are aspects of industrial policy which are shockingly gender exploitative as well. And this has really to do with which industries are recognized as the important industries of the future. So whether you're looking at the European Green New Deal, or you're looking at the US IRA, or you're looking at industrial policies in Indonesia or somewhere else, you find that the care activities are simply not even considered an industry. They're not even thought of as an important economic activity of the future that has to be promoted. And yet we know that one of the big problems in most economies today is employment generation. We know that care activities along with the creative sector are possibly the two economic activities that will continue to be hugely reliant on labor, no matter what happens to technology. You will never replace human labor in care or in creative industries with technology. You can support it, but you will not replace it, which is unlike a whole bunch of other activities, let's admit. And yet care is never treated as a major industrial sector to support. And it's not even brought in there as an important variable. We have a lot of studies now about the massive multiplier effects of care work. There's a study by the UK Women's Budget Group that tells us that the multiplier of investment in care is 4, whereas the multiplier for investment in infrastructure is 1.5. So it's a significant difference actually, right? Yet we are in a world in which industrial policies are seen as really part of that so-called formal economy, which will continue to be subsidized and fed into by this huge substratum of unpaid care. And this is also true for a whole range of trade and foreign investment policies and so on. I could go on and on. My real point is this, is that if we have to stop thinking of feminist economics as a different branch of economics. It's not. It is really that it gives you a perspective with which to look at every other aspect of economic life. And the reason we have to do that is because economies persist in relying heavily on this gender inequality, even when they don't talk about it. So essentially, what I want to emphasize is that we need a gender perspective, not only because we want to be nice to women or we are women or whatever. We need it because we cannot understand a whole bunch of economic processes otherwise. And we certainly cannot understand either how economic policies get formed in particular ways, how they get designed and implemented in particular ways, or what the impact of that will be on people at large. And that means also that the impact it will have not just on men, but also on children and the elderly and everyone else. And so, yeah, I don't know if I took 20 minutes, but I hope that's pretty much what I had to say. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I hope I get to hear it. Thank you.